Welcome back, boys. Today we're checking out why the elites can't solve the demographic crisis.
Why are states so ineffective in trying to combat the fertility crisis? Even though the demographic collapse it will lead to empirically is one of the most palpable threats to the current socio-political order. How come states either seem to not really acknowledge the severity of the issue at hand and they just kind of ignore it, or if they actually try to combat the terminal decline, they are utterly unsuccessful? For a long time, I was struggling with this question. The final breakthrough in my thinking about this issue came just recently, when I finished the book Leviathan and Its Enemies by Samuel T. Francis.
I was trying to buy this book, but I couldn't find it anywhere.
Which many people repeatedly recommended to me as an essential read for understanding our current day and age. And I have to admit, these folks were correct. The book truly is an outstanding read, and it contains many deeply insightful observations and conclusions. I do recommend everyone to read it. The subject of the book is the description of the so-called managerial revolution, which is the emergence of an entirely new ruling elite in the West, and many other parts of the planet as well, composed of broadly defined managerial class, or people that derive their elite membership and positions of influence by having a particular set of managerial, technical, or verbal skills, obtained most often by college education. To put it crudely, with a considerable amount of simplification, it is the rule of the experts. Now, there are many videos on YouTube dedicated to this piece of literature, so I won't just create another video describing what the book is about and why it is brilliant. I obviously will concisely describe the central hypothesis of the book, so this video is completely understandable for all of you who have not read the book. But being the demographics-focused person that I am, I couldn't help but constantly apply the concepts described in the book to the topic of demographics, even though the text itself does not directly engages with the issue of population decline, demographic crisis, or subreplacement fertility. However, the book's content is highly relevant in this regard, even though Samuel Francis does not mention it at all, especially the parts dedicated to the basic ideological paradigms of managerial ideology. The book was written quite a long time ago, in the 1990s I think, and it is a culmination of the lifelong observations of the author, which means that the book was created in an environment before the population decline was even an issue. At the time, the topic keeping everybody awake at night was likely still overpopulation. However, reading the book nevertheless confirmed some of my long-time growing inner persuasions about the nature of our current issues. I came to the conclusion that there is no way out of the current pickle without complete and overwhelming change in the overall paradigm of how our societies are governed, the elites that govern them, and the ideological dogmas under which those elites function. That is the case because certain grave contradictions are at the heart of the current ideological model. So, let's look at how the managerial regime and its ideology contribute to the inability even to scratch the surface of our current demographic crisis. The book proposes that during the first half of the 20th century, and especially after World War II, a new managerial ruling elite established itself in the United States, Western Europe, and other developed industrial countries. While Samuel Francis uses the term managerial elite, it is not only the people who are professional managers per se he is talking about. It is the overall technocratic structure that spans corporate businesses, state and international organization bureaucracies, academic and educational institutions, mass media, and cultural institutions. It is the overall expert class. Now, this new elite did not just emerge out of thin air. It was a response to the breakneck level of development that came with the Industrial Revolution and the massive increase in populations and complexity that the technological development brought. While the author does not use this term, he is basically describing the rapid growth phase of the demographic transition, a term my viewers are surely familiar with, especially those few who watched my previous video. As the population rapidly grew and moved into the cities to take jobs in the booming industrial plants, it created a completely new social paradigm, in which the previously applied ways of organizing society were just lacking. The massively rising overall and especially urban populations created a need for new forms of management of social, economic and political issues, the so-called mass organizations in state, economics, education, culture and media. States that wanted to succeed in the competition of the industrial age needed to foster managerial skills, since the rapidly rising complexity of economic, social and military affairs required increasingly technically sophisticated ways of management in order not to break down. The previous bourgeoisie-led order was based on localized networks of relationships, based on the personal and kinship relations of the entrepreneurs and owners of industrial operations. As the more localized and smaller-scale economic units started to grow and turn into vast nation-scale operations, a new class of people started to take the spotlight. Professional managers who derived their position not from starting their own business or inheriting it from their parents, but by possessing the technical skills required to operate such a behemoth economic structure. Founder-led businesses turned into corporations, where the effective control is held in the hands of managers, while the ownership structure is divided between hundreds and thousands of shareholders, who mostly just focus on their revenue streams. That was connected with the increasing fusion of the economy with the state, whose powers expanded through a never-growing and powerful bureaucracy, and executive branch overshadowing the traditionally most important legislative branch. The synergy of the state with mass corporations was advantageous because of the ability of the state to regulate demand through interest rates, public spending, and tax rates, which helps corporations better regulate their economic output. On the cultural front, the managerial elites in the state bureaucracies and mass corporations aligned with the mass organizations in media, educational institutions, mass entertainment, and even religious institutions to help shape the ideological leanings of the population. Now, this might sound a bit conspiratorial, some big secret agreement between corporations, government bureaucrats, and even media or entertainment companies to nefariously manipulate the hearts and minds of the people. But it is more about the implicit practical impacts of any given decision than about the overtly ideological substance of it. So, the question to ask when analyzing political decisions is not necessarily if this decision is leftist, rightist, progressive or conservative. It is whether this decision will help to expand the power of the technocratic managerial class. Everything makes much more sense when you start looking at things through these lenses. It is nevertheless the truth that most often, the interests of the managerial class do overlap with the leftist or progressive policies much more than with anything from the other side of the political spectrum. Samuel Francis defines managerial ideology as a combination of cosmopolitanism, hedonism, meliorism, utopism, and scientism. Now, I know that was a lot of isms, but we will go through them one by one. To use a couple of direct quotes from the book, quote, "The process of homogenization is rationalized by a cosmopolitan ideology that regards the social and cultural differentiations of the bourgeoisie order as backward, artificial, and repressive. The tendency to homogenize the audiences of mass media is evident in mass advertising. Mass consumption presupposes a uniformity of wants on the part of all consumers, and advertising must instill in the consumer a demand for uniform products. Uniformity of demand presupposes uniformity in the character of the consumers. That is unnecessary and virtually impossible in the smaller scale economy of the bourgeoisie order. The differentiated products of localized bourgeoisie enterprises cannot be marketed to consumers far removed from the place of production and different in tastes, knowledge, manners, and needs from the consumers of the local market. Thus, the economy of mass consumption is rationalized through the formulation and dissemination of an ideology and ethic of hedonism that legitimizes the gratification of appetites and material aspirations through the consumption of goods and services produced by the mass economic organizations. Similarly, the bureaucratic state involved in the engineering of political, economic, and social institutions through the application of managerial skills requires the formulation of a meliorist or utopian ideology that legitimizes the functions and power of the bureaucratic elite of the state. A fundamental element of the managerial ideology and ethic is its presupposition of scientism, the premise that with the same techniques that have worked in the physical sciences, we can eventually create an exact science of man. The scientific premises of the managerial ideology and ethic offer a rationalization for the application of managerial skills and techniques to political, economic, and social and cultural arrangements, and for the power of the managerial elite. The result is the synthesis of hedonistic, meliorist, and utopian cosmopolitan and scientific elements into a popularized ideology that seek to replace the bourgeoisie ideologies and ethic as the fundamental public orthodoxy and moral code of managerial society. The underlying myth or idea of the managerial orthodoxy is that human potential is most nearly fulfilled in a collective or mass activities that reflect emancipation from traditional, particularistic, and separative identities, loyalties, and individualist selfishness through cosmopolitan interaction, liberation from obsolete and restrictive morality through a hedonistic ethic, and the amelioration of society, man, and the world through the meliorist or utopian engineering of social, economic, and political arrangements by the manipulative application of managerial skills. End of quote. The primary interest of the managerial elite is to expand its own influence and power. That is nothing uncommon throughout history. Most elites in various historical periods behaved precisely like that. The way to do it is to promote ideological and political leanings that encourage the biggest amount of technocratic interference in all ways of life: economic, social, cultural, and such. Society is perfectible. Humans are inherently good and more or less the same across cultural and ethnic groups. It's only the environmental and social influences of various allegedly harmful and anachronistic residuals of previous cultural, religious, and ethical norms that make society and life in it problematic. The way to get rid of these residuals is by constantly advancing the progress of scientific approaches towards life and human beings. The managerial classes are thus utopianist, cosmopolitan, and meliorist. The perfect society can be engineered. The values that drive people's lives should not be derived from the traditional ethical norms, usually grounded in religious thought, but from the expertise of sociologists, psychologists, and other experts. That is why there is a persistent anti-clerical and culturally progressivist streak among the managerial classes. It's not really about the managerial elites themselves being persuaded about these ideologies. They likely often aren't. It is more about the underlying implications of these ideologies not being in opposition to the managerial ideology, and they can thus be easily incorporated into the managerial elite. Modern progressivism encompasses massive enlargement of managerial positions, aimed to describe and regulate all the newly discovered severe problems of society regarding race relations, sexual identities, or patriarchal oppression, for example in the form of DEI and ESG departments or in academia. You can argue the same with radical environmentalism, which once again creates the platform for new government climate departments, international panels, government-subsidized production of renewable energy sources, and such. That is not to claim that climate change is not a real issue. Still, no one will persuade me that there isn't a palpable interest of the people who engage in researching it and designing possible solutions to present it as the most severe threat possible, especially one that can be dealt with through their supervision. Any form of expansion of the power of international organizations is in sync with the managerial interest, since professional bureaucratic staffs adhering to the managerial class are running these institutions. The expanding power of the courts, increasingly interfering with subjects previously reserved for the legislative power, is also part of the expansion of the managerial power. On the business level, it might seem counterintuitive at first that corporations would support more government bureaucratic interference in the economy. However, that is usually true of smaller or middle-sized businesses, not of the giant multinational corporations. They actually thrive in an environment with massive interconnectedness between the state and the economy. They have the scale to navigate the regulations and the various governmental subsidies, and the economic power to influence the shape of said regulations via lobbying in Washington or Brussels or whatever. Now, the book is focused almost entirely on the US, but I would argue that modern Europe has reached an even higher level of managerial elite domination than America. But maybe that is only my perception due to lesser exposure to American realities, who knows. In my experience, it is usually not the CEO of some multinational mammoth corporation complaining about the massive amount of EU regulations, but the owner and founder of some middle-sized company that feels the heat and often cannot continue to function in this environment. In this way, the larger corporations can eliminate competition from smaller enterprises. Expansion of state and public spending, very often through debt financing, helped create a broader consumer base for the products of the corporations. Every expansion of the welfare state or overall state interference in various ways of life creates new bureaucratic position needed to administer these new flows of funds. Now, on the part of the managerial domination of educational institutions and mass media, they partake in molding public opinion in several ways. Firstly, through education reconstructed in a way that creates effective employees who serve the needs of the mass corporations and the state. Secondly, to further reinforce the ideological basis of the managerial regime, by portraying it as the most rational and just way of running society, and through constant ideological attacks on the former ethical and ideological values centered around tradition, national or ethnic communality, religion, and so on. And thirdly, by pushing the message of hedonism and instant gratification to encourage the consumerist aspirations, suited to be satisfied by mass corporations. One of the best examples of how this works is the currently expanding anti-disinformation industry. It is basically the creation of some kind of college-educated truth experts that will allegedly distill what is objective information and what is some form of nefarious manipulation that is undermining the credibility of the institutions, or, in other words, the managerial elite. The nefarious manipulations are obviously usually that information that goes against the narrative advantageous for the elite, and vice versa. Now, the book is about 700 pages long, so this is a very crude TLDR. There are countless other examples of the managerial elite workings, and I could go on about them for another 20 minutes. But I hope this is sufficient introduction to the book's main thesis. Now, the thing to understand is that these claims aren't directed against sciences like sociology, psychology, or environmentalism. I love sociology. Demographics are part of it. Same as it is not a critique of management as such, since that would be absurd. But those things should be tools, a means to achieve an end, not the end itself, which they became. And it is not working. Now, Samuel Francis proposes that the biggest weakness of the managerial regime is its inability to use force, and inspire people to have sufficient loyalties to be able to use force and potentially die in its name. Firstly, because the basic ideological ethos of the managerial ideology is inherently pacifistic. Since if you are to propose that rational, scientific, managerial ways of dealing with issues are the obviously superior ones, violence cannot be seen as a legitimate way of dealing with social or international issues. Secondly, the managerial elite is recruited from people whose psychological makeup is not suitable for force and violence, but more for cunningness, deception, compromise, and manipulation. And thirdly, if you systematically deconstruct all the previously valid ethical and value systems that aroused loyalty, self-sacrifice, and bravery, such as patriotism, ethnocentrism, religious fervor, or such, in the name of the hedonistic ideology of self-gratification, you will inevitably end up with a population completely unwilling to fight for the system. Something that is clearly happening throughout the West. Samuel Francis also describes the process of the managerial revolution taking place within the military and law enforcement forces. Now, with this not so brief introduction in mind, let's finally proceed to the main course of this YouTube feast. Application of the previously outlined concept to demographics. Now, I honestly do not think that the managerial elite is antinatalist by conviction. There might be certain ideological niches within it, such as radical environmentalism or certain facets of radical feminism, but it is not the overall conviction. Kind of by definition, the population collapse creates a huge issue for its functioning. It will inevitably create scarcity, and the regimes will have massive issues maintaining legitimacy, due to the consequential unsustainability of welfare systems that the managerial elites administer. I think they would honestly love to figure it out, without negatively influencing the other fundamentals of the managerial regime, to have their cake and eat it too. But they can't, since the tools at their disposal are useless in this regard. Only through autonomous social institutions that the managerial elite systematically dismantled for decades can the demographic crisis be figured out. It is quite ironic that the regime that has on its side the alleged untamed power of modern social sciences cannot incentivize people to do the most basic pro-social behavior in human nature, to procreate and thus ensure the continuation of society itself. One of the leading Czech demographers, Tomáš Sobotka, estimated that the modern state can improve fertility by about 0.2 children per woman through various social policies and perfectly calibrated spending. That is the extent to which the expert class can theoretically improve fertility rates. Due to the basically inexhaustible source of
0.2, that's like nothing, really.
Expertise in social science on the part of the regime, that is really underwhelming. There are many reasons for this. Firstly, the managerial ideology promotes hedonism and instant gratification to boost mass consumption. But having children is to a certain extent the antidote to instant gratification. Unless you are very wealthy, having children will inevitably restrict one's ability to consume on the same level as previously, due to the costs connected to child rearing. And even if one is wealthy and does have the means to afford children without restricting his consumption ability purely through available funds, it still restricts it through time. Having children is probably even more time restrictive than it is cash restrictive. A good example of this is traveling. We live in a time when traveling was sold to people as an aspirational lifestyle, without which your life wouldn't be complete. And traveling is great, I like it the same as everyone else. But you do not need it for a happy and fulfilled life. You do not need to
Yeah, I've met many people, especially women, that just want to travel the world indefinitely.
Spend Euro weekends in every overcrowded European capital with a nice cathedral to be happy. I always use the comparison with my grandparents in these cases. My grandparents, living during the communist period, were like twice in Bulgaria during their lifetimes. But the idea that they were not happy because of it is ridiculous. They were honestly happier than most people are today. That is not meant to be a defense of communism in any way, shape or form. There is a pretty thin line between attacking overt consumerism and attacking the increasing living standards of the population, which is clearly misguided. Capitalism is the most efficient way of organizing economic relations in a society. But capitalism, or any other economic system, does not exist in a vacuum. Its specific characteristics are shaped by the cultural environment in which it operates. In the absence of other strongly shared values, consumption might become a goal in itself, instead of just being a mean to achieve a more comfortable or civilized life. However, as I already alluded, having children opposes the overreaching atmosphere of hedonistic instant gratification that is dominant in society. Most modern mass advertising is incredibly narcissistic in nature, being centered around the idea of youth cult and the ability to fulfill your momentary wishes being presented as a virtue. All this sentiment goes against the idea of having children, since they, by definition, are a long-term investment of sorts. Now, I am a father, so I do have some insight into this topic, even though I do not pretend to be some kind of expert. But to have children is by definition something you do with a sort of long-term outlook on your life. What I witness in many people who claim they do not want to have kids is that they tend to view their life as if they were never to age past 40 or maybe 50. But statistically speaking, you probably will. To have children means acknowledging that the consumerist lifestyle, consisting of traveling, visiting music festivals or whatever, will not fulfill you indefinitely. Eventually, you will turn from the young, hip person in the commercial for Zalando to the old person with sore joints, whose children give the newest joint supplements for Christmas. Now, I have spent some time volunteering with my wife in an old folks' home. Let me tell you, being an elderly person without a family is probably the most depressing fate you can imagine in our current social order. No one cares about you if you
Yeah, there's a lot of like really lonely old people.
are an old person without a family. You do not
Nobody visits you, nobody gives a fuck about you. So if you don't want that fate, you should do everything you can to find a good woman, traditional woman, and start a family. But seems like the most traditional women are overseas. They're not in the West.
do not make or spend real money anymore, so you are not of much use to the consumerist machine. The system just kind of waits for you to die and stop depleting its resources. It's sad, but it is the truth.
Yeah.
Anyway, that is the hedonistic consumerism side of the equation. Another side of it is the fact that the rearing of children and parenthood itself was ridiculously commodified. It is treated as just another wish to be satisfied after you already feel oversaturated by all the other consumerist aspirations of your childless life. As a parent in this day and age, you feel like you need to buy so much stuff that you actually do not really need at all. Now, I'm no better. We also have all the stuff at home. We also succumb to the algorithmic advertisement machine. It then creates an illusion that children are more expensive than they really are. Because since all the other mothers have all those gadgets for their children, women feel like they need them too. But they don't. Why? Well, when your grandparents had your parents 50 years ago, they did not have like 90% of the stuff. What happened? Nothing. Your parents normally grew up to be productive members of society. At least hopefully. That goes also for the overall educational preparation for being a parent. Due to the constant push for the delegitimization of previously functional patterns of behavior and ethical norms, and the constant need to apply new scientific procedures in every aspect of life, there is now this pressure to meticulously prepare for being a parent by reading books and listening to bambillion of podcasts on parenting, not to make any mistake. People then might get the impression that it is something incredibly complicated, for which you need to ideally undergo some form of professional training. That is kind of absurd. I mean, do not get me wrong, I definitely do not want to ridicule or in any way diminish if people are responsibly preparing. Some things are very useful, like the first aid course for newborns. But people often tend to kind of fall under this pressure that they won't be able to do it just right according to the newest findings of child psychology or whatever. I mean, it is not a nuclear reactor. It is a tiny human. Do not drop the baby on its head. Your parents were able to do it, and so were your grandparents.
Do not drop the baby, and it probably will grow up to be a good member of society.
My grandmother is one of 10 siblings. Her mother probably wasn't that much into podcasts about parenting. Maybe it is better to ask your grandparents who raised your parents, aunts and uncles, instead of listening to a podcast series by some woman with PhD in child psychology who managed to have one kid at 36 years. And modern psychology can also be wrong. One of the biggest paradoxes of our times is that we are living in a time of the biggest abundance of psychological care, at least in our secular reductive understanding of it, in human history, while simultaneously also living through the biggest epidemic of mental health issues in human history. Isn't that strange? And the answer of the expert class is always the same. We need more psychological care. But the emperor is obviously naked. Modern mainstream secular psychology, stripped of all metaphysical substance, clearly does not have the answers. We are now getting to the core of the issue. Samuel Francis proposes that the managerial regime cannot withstand a serious crisis, because all the autonomous social institutions that arouse loyalty, group cohesion, and willingness for self-sacrifice are systematically dismantled by the managerial regime and portrayed.
I don't really know any young man that would die for the system. Like truly, it's like, what are you sacrificing yourself for? Most men I meet are like me. They have nothing really, no property, no real bonds, no real friendships, no children. It is what it is.
As oppressive, harmful, or just anachronistic to expand the social power of the managerial elites. But the weak spot is that when you persuade people that all of the things that would encourage loyalty and self-sacrifice, like national pride, religious faith, ethnic community, local tradition and so on, are wrong and illegitimate in order to replace them with domains dominated by experts and technocrats, you will end up with an empty and atomized world, where the whole legitimacy of the system depends just on material well-being, and people won't put their lives on the line if the system gets under external or internal pressure. They say that if you have nothing to die for, you have nothing to live for. I would say we might extend this statement to procreation. If there is a world in which there is nothing to die for, and, therefore, nothing to live for, is it worth bringing children to such a world? Some aspects of human condition are very primal and hard to understand through the paradigm of
People are stressed. Like living in like these urban areas is really fucking it's stressing people out. And of course, even if some people had the ability or the funds to have children, they still wouldn't do it because they're stressed the fuck out.
modern psychology. Giving your life for something and bringing new life to this world might be strangely connected in some ways. If you are deeply embedded in your culture, community, rituals, and traditions, you hold them in high esteem, and the world and your place in it makes sense to you because of them. Having children to ensure its continuation makes perfect sense. You can't just scientifically manage people into having families if they feel alienated from their culture, are anxious about the future, and you simultaneously tell them to pursue immediate satisfaction through never-ending consumer options. People often say to me that they do not know if they want to bring children into this world, since it is evil and full of suffering. This statement will seem absurd and nonsensical if you look at it from the perspective of material well-being or security. If you live in a somewhat developed country, your physical safety has never been as secure in history as it is today. Statistically, you will live to an incredibly high age by historical standards. The probability that you will be killed in a war, by bandits, or during work due to hazardous working conditions has never been lower. If you, however, change your perspective and look at the statement from the point of view of internal perception of the world, it starts to make a whole lot of sense. I believe that people saying this often might not be able to put their finger on it, but they are speaking about spiritual emptiness, causing a vague sense of anxiety about the future. I'm generally relatively skeptical about purely economic reasons for low fertility. I do not want to underplay the fact that there are people whose economic situation is dire, and it is genuinely hard or impossible for them to provide for their families.
Yeah, in my opinion, it is mainly economic, but there is a spiritual aspect to it as well.
But generally, it is precisely because of the erosion of values and the reduction of life to
Like death of like strong family units and religion, of course. There is no like community. Back in the day, if you lived in a small village and you just married a woman or you just had a child, the whole fucking village would visit and help and give gifts and give advice and help. But now it's like you're on your own. It's you against the world. It's just you and a woman, and you don't get really like there's no like community in that sense anymore.
a spree of mass consumption, that the purely economic and material conditions suddenly rise to such prominence. Another crucial ideological dogma of the managerial regime is the insistence on maximizing female participation in the workforce. Now, it is not hard to see why.
Yeah, I mean, the more women work, of course, fertility is gonna go down because I don't know. Surely they must know, right?
All it takes is to check Wikipedia's article on women in the workforce. Quote, largely seen as a boon for industrial society, women in the workforce contribute to a higher national economic output, as measured in GDP, as well as decreasing labor costs by increasing the labor supply in the society. Office work that does not require heavy labor expanded, and women increasingly acquired the higher education that led to better compensated, longer-term careers, rather than lower-skilled, shorter-term jobs.
But the longer they are working or in education, like school, college, the less children they can output in their window of what's it called, fertility.
Mothers are less likely to be employed, unlike men and women without children. End of quote. The expansion of the workforce by the inclusion of basically half of the population is obviously pretty awesome if you are an employer. But it comes with a significant price. It represents one of the many crucial contradictions within the system. It unleashed social forces that will eventually lead to its downfall, in one way or the other. In the center of all the autonomous social institutions that the managerial ideology gradually dismantled is the family, the most fundamental social unit and bastion of autonomy and privacy, separated from the public sphere. As the family is slowly disintegrating as a primary unit of social cohabitation on the micro level,
There's still, for example, in Poland and Romania, it's beautiful there. There's big families and extended families, uh,
this
which help out.
development will be reflected on the macro societal level. The managerial elite cannot solve the fertility crisis because any realistic solution directly contradicts the ideological tenets of its functioning. That will be one of the things leading to its downfall.
Yeah, expecting the elites to fix demographics is like asking a tapeworm to solve world hunger. The dopamine rush of feeling superior because I'm studying the collapse of the Western status quo and I'm doing absolutely nothing about it. I take care of old people for a living. Even the people with children have no one to care for them. It's all depressing. People are not really old people have children, but they were never raised to like take care of them, you know? I live in Germany as a foreigner. A few months ago, I went to a concert with a native friend. The singer sang an unpublished song of him. It was in German, and my friend explained it to me. The song was about the singer's life. It tells that he was unmarried and childless despite being in his mid-30s, but he should not worry because living the moment is more important, something like that. And that song, my friends, that song summarizes the mindset of the Western Europeans, men and women, are currently at. In the UK, we don't allow child benefits for more than 2 children, but we give money to households with up to 4 wives. The UK is done. The South Korean population pyramid is such a depressing image. What do you boys think? This one was something. I appreciate everybody for tuning in. Like, sub, comment. It really helps me out, especially with the algorithm. I see you boys in the next one, okay?